I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom, and I'll be moderating our next panel. Throughout the day, we have heard from many distinguished speakers about the existential threats that Christians in the Middle East are facing. ISIS's takeover of Mosul was perhaps the most dramatic incident that brought the world's attention to the problem faced by Middle East Christians, but it is hardly the only one. In Syria, ISIS is joined by other Islamist groups, Al-Nusra Front, the Al-Qaeda Syria's branch, and other groups that might have different strategies and techniques, but that all share a hatred of Christianity and Christians. In Libya, we have seen the cancer spread outside of the Levant as we watched the brutal beheadings of Coptic Christians, followed by Ethiopian Christians at the hands of an ISIS branch inside Libya. Lebanon hangs in the balance as the threat of a spread of the larger Sunni-Shiite conflict or of the Syrian civil war into that country might doom the fate of its Christian population. This is also the case in a place like Egypt, where we already have a local branch of ISIS in the Sinai that has already ensured that the northern eastern part of that peninsula is Christian free, no longer a place where any Christian lives, driven out by the bombings of churches and the kidnappings there. As we've heard the stories of what the problem is or the plight of Christians in the Middle East, we also heard from many distinguished speakers about what could be done in the form of humanitarian aid and in a discussion about the larger context of American grand strategy. To the last panel falls the task of actually specifying what can be done to solve the problem. In order to do that, we have enlisted 4 distinguished speakers that have given the issue much thought in their own writings and in their different talks. The speakers whose bios you have already in the papers that were handed to you will be in the order that they will be speaking. We will start with Mindy Belz, who's the editor of World Magazine and the author of a forthcoming book on Iraq. She will be followed by the Reverend Johnny Moore, who's the author of Defying ISIS and co-founder of the Cradle Fund. Following him will be Joseph Kassab, the president and founder of Iraqi Christian Advocacy and Empowerment Institute. Lastly, will be speaking Kirsten Powers, who's a columnist at US Today and the author of The Silencing: How the Left is Killing Free Speech. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Good afternoon. I want to give you a picture before speaking about a specific solution. I don't know that any of us will be that bold, but I was in Iraq in March. And I stood atop one of the churches in one of the emptied cities of Nineveh Plain, just north of Mosul. This was a church that was built in the 5th or the 6th century, before Christianity reached England. A church that inside its mostly demolished chancel had Syriac or Aramaic scripture in the archways that were that dated back to 1569. So before there had been any sort of Jamestown settlement of any sort of Christianity as we know it here in this continent. And so looking through the binoculars from atop this ancient church or through a gun scope from an area where there had been a continuous Christian presence for over 1,000 years, you could see in the distance the black flags of ISIS. The front line for the Islamic militants that they have staked out in the middle of Nineveh Plain was barely a mile and a half from where I was standing. ISIS is actually building trenches there. We watched them with their diggers and their front loaders. They're building trenches about 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. I'm sorry, 5 meters deep and 5 meters wide, and they're putting concrete barriers in the middle of them. Why are they doing this? Because they fully expect that there will be some sort of armed offensive to take back Mosul, and they're getting ready for it. They intend on fighting that. Last August, ISIS overran 22 of these ancient Assyrian villages in Nineveh Plain. We've heard a lot about that today so far. And then about 10 to 14 days later, the Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga, came in and took back about 5 of those cities. And this is the area where I was. I was standing, the church that I was in Bakofa, and it is currently in the hands of a Christian militia known as Duetnosha, which is a unit of about 500 mostly Assyrian Christian men. I toured Bakofa in their company, and we were close enough, actually, and I just realized I have this on my phone, so I thought if we're quiet enough, I'll play this. We were actually close enough that they were picking up the radio transmissions of ISIS. We can. Yeah.
هو بس للتشويشي ما يطلعوا راسه
If you heard, one of them was calling one of his compatriots Bin Laden. Their call names were Bin Laden and Taliban. And the guys who listen to this all day long told me that they hear them speaking English, Arabic, Urdu, Pashtun. They are men who come from all over. So we all know that ISIS has been on the march since last March, that the Kurdish forces moved in, that they have come in and protected some of these areas. I think it's important to realize, though, that they came in and retook some of these towns house to house. This was not a swift battle. It was a very difficult battle. They received support from U.S. airstrikes, as most of us remember, just in time. I spoke with Kurdish officials in Iraqi Kurdistan who were actually shredding documents because ISIS was that close. And short of U.S. airstrikes that came there in the middle of August, they don't know what would have happened. What's less known about this is that since that time, 9 months since the ISIS invasion of Nineveh Plain, the Kurdish forces with this alliance of other militias have been holding a 640-mile front that stretches from the border with Syria to the border with Iran. And that is a military feat. They have been obviously supported by U.S. airstrikes. That has been intermittent. It has been essential. But on the ground, they have been holding this front line. No one can return to the cities where I was because it's simply too dangerous. It's too close. ISIS has 81 millimeter mortars, and they are shelling regularly. I can attest to that. Those mortars have a 3 to 4 mile range. So these areas, even that have been reclaimed, are still very much in danger, and no one will allow residents to go back there. No residents actually want to go back there at this point. So as we walked through these cities, and it's truly an eerie thing. If you think about the opening of the Book of Lamentations, it says, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. And it's one of the eeriest things I've been in some of these towns back in 2007, 2008. And to go back and the baker's not baking, the school children aren't going to school, monasteries not functioning, and nothing. It's completely empty but for a goat or a donkey. is truly strange. One of the soldiers with Dwight Narsha said to me, "You have probably seen worse than this, but there's nothing worse than a city without people. It's a graveyard." And so you will see the checkpoints, and you'll see soldiers and weapons, and overhead you can hear the F-16s as they cross the sound barrier. And you are looking out, and you know that in the distance is this line of battle. And one of the soldiers there said, "Kurdistan right here is fighting on behalf of the whole world." So who are these people fighting on behalf of the whole world against ISIS? The group that I was with, that I've mentioned, Dwight Narsha, is an Assyrian group. Their name comes from Syriac, and it means sacrificers or self-sacrificers. They formed last summer. Their commanders are training and organizing about 500 men. They are working in shifts of 250 each. I would estimate, and it's only an estimate when I was there, that they probably had about 200 guns. They're only able to work in these shifts because they don't have enough weapons, and they're sharing weapons. One of the commanders who helped form this militia, and this is a man, keep in mind for these people, this is a man who is helping to free Assyrians who were kidnapped 2005 to 2008. This is a man who himself was kidnapped in 2007 and was held by al-Qaeda in Iraq for, I believe, 5 days. There was a dramatic negotiation for his release. They were going to pay $30,000 in ransom, and at the last minute he was able to escape and was very glad that the ransom was never paid. These are the kind of people that are forming these militias. He said, "After Islamic State advanced in Mosul and Nineveh Plain, we concluded that just calling for help at the political level doesn't bring anything. We start to see it as our task, our obligation to participate in freeing our land. It's not acceptable to watch our lands taken by terrorist groups and expect the Kurds to come and liberate us. And we just watch while the Kurds fight. It's our land and our people, so we have to be active." Dwight Narsha has been, as I said, sharing weapons, sharing food that's being provided by the Kurds. They have funding from Assyrians living overseas. They actually received night vision capability, which has raised them in the eyes of everyone, because even the Kurds don't have that. And it came from a country in the West, not the United States, and they said that I should never say where it came from. And they have enough weapons that I'm going to listen to them. And they are getting some training from former American soldiers. I was, a little bit surprised. We've all seen the stories. We've been talking. I've talked with a few of you here about it here today. It's a problematic area. I myself, coming back through border control, entering back into the United States, was held up for 2 hours and questioned by our own American officials seeking to protect us, but was questioned just about this aspect of it. So it's a very difficult and a controversial thing, but I will tell you that they are receiving training from American soldiers who are there in differing capacities, from Americans who are there who have military background, and are working on the ground with them. Not surprisingly, this is all controversial, and we've heard some of that today. We've heard a few different comments about the militias. There are a number of clergy in the region who's opposed them and who naturally would from a theological perspective. The Chaldean Archbishop Bashar Warda said, "We as a church have made it clear from the outset that we are against a separate Christian militia. We suggest that our young people, if they are so inclined, join the Kurdish or Iraqi forces." And actually, I had this encounter when I asked one of the Assyrian militiamen with his gun. I said, "Have you fired that gun yet?" And he said, unfortunately not, but I hope to. And I was getting translation at that point from an Assyrian priest. And the Assyrian priest said, he said, I hope to, but I'm saying hopefully not. I hope he never fires his gun. So there is, within the church, there is these differing views. But there also are church leaders who see that their only role, their only hope, I should say, in holding the 640-mile front line is military intervention of some sort. And at this point, they have the courage to rely on for that on the ground. Imagine Baltimore this past week with no National Guard. These communities, as I say, have been, even in the time that I have been going to Iraq, which was shortly after 9/11, and I've been going there continuously since the Iraq War began, these communities have never had real military protection, real police protection, what we assume will happen if our own communities here in the United States get into trouble, and we assume that the police and the National Guard will show up. They haven't had those kinds of solutions, and what they face now, as you've heard repeated today, is they face seeing their communities are completely cleansed, and they see themselves as having no other option. One of the Assyrians leaders there in the region said, we fear that what we will be left with are only two solutions: a police state or a Sharia state. And we would like a citizenship state. We would like a state where individual rights are respected, regardless of ethnic identity or religious affiliation. And how could we here in the United States want less for them than that? 10 days ago, more or less, Dwight Nasha did see some action. They encountered about 18 ISIS fighters coming toward these villages that I've been describing. They fought them and killed 2 of them, and they escaped without having fatalities. But I've been told by the soldiers who are there that they are seeing more and more mortar firings coming from ISIS, and that they are improving in their accuracy and their strength. Their range is growing. So we know that on the other side that the intent is serious. They intend to fight off whatever force comes at them, even in Mosul. And they intend to, and they have proven to be a very sophisticated adversary. And so this is the sense in which the Assyrians who have lived in these communities continuously for thousands of years feel that they have no choice but to be armed. I asked one of the militia commanders, you could probably be in Germany or somewhere else. Why is it so important to be here? And he said, this is our link to our history and to our future. This is where our forefathers put down our roots, where we have our heritage. Now that we see what ISIS did, our mothers crying, our children without shoes, our people with no home, there's extra reason to be on the ground here, sacrificing our souls to preserve our land and our people. So thank you.
My name is Johnny Moore. I'm just so pleased to be here with so many people that I believe care as I do about the situation. And I think a lot of you, probably like me, feel sometimes isolated, knowing a bit more about what's happening than people are willing to admit or people even know. And so there's something very, very powerful about being in a space like this. But actually, I was probably introduced to this crisis differently than most of you. I have zero connection to Iraq or Syria. I'm not even a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian. I'm not even a Protestant in the traditional sense. I'm an evangelical, whatever that means. I really had zero. I have no family in the military. I don't have anybody that fought in Iraq. In fact, I spent most of my time going to India when I was in college. I went there 14 times, and I married a Brazilian. I had zero connection to that part of the world. But I had a mentor. And my mentor is a famous pastor. His name is Rick Warren, and he's traveled all around the world doing lots and lots of interesting things. And by happenstance, I ended up in a meeting with him in Jordan. And the meeting was convened by the king and by Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad, the prince in charge of religious affairs. And I sat in that room, in the side of the room, as I listened to 3 cardinals and 5 patriarchs and representatives of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant communities, and a few evangelicals from all over that region in August, a year before ISIS took over Mosul, describe in vivid detail exactly what was going to happen. They named the actors, they named the cities, they named the strategy, they named the terrorism, and the world was quiet. And I was quiet because I wasn't a principal to the meeting. I was sitting in the back of the room, like some of you maybe sit in the back of the room today. But it's irked me for months. And so finally, I decided, because I had a little bit of a platform myself in speaking and writing, I would write on the subject. And I just wrote this article that said we must stand up for Middle East Christians. And the article was shared within 48 hours by 50,000 people all over the world. And the next thing I know, I start getting calls from important people asking me to talk about this thing that I was just acquainting myself with. And I believe that experience and knowledge is a stewardship, and it's a responsibility. And so I felt in my heart that I was somehow called to speak up for these people whose language I don't speak, whose countries I don't know, but whose faith I share. And I remember, not too long ago, I live in Los Angeles, and I was coming away from a dinner in Beverly Hills with the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. I'm not Jewish either. I just happened to be there. And I listened as they described the experience of their parents and their grandparents' generation. And it was an incredibly surreal experience for me. I'd just 6 months earlier been at Yad Vashem for the Mashoah commemoration, and had learned about it in school and watched Schindler's List. Who hasn't? And I was moved by it, but it was moved on a different level when I was hearing these eyewitness accounts. And then I came back to my house that evening, and at this point I was thinking about writing a book about all this, a book that became Defying ISIS. And I opened up my email, and I had an email, and the subject line was awaiting death. And the email was written from a pastor in Syria. Maybe some of you have read it. And the email was describing, in live reporting, as he sat in the darkness of his home, as the mortars were hitting the buildings all around him. And he's writing this email as it's happening. I felt like it was like the Diary of Anne Frank or something. He's writing this, and then he says, it just hit us now. And the lights are off, and all I hear is screams. And what do? Do I just lay here in my bed and die? Do I run outside and try to flee? And that was the email. And I decided I had to go see it for myself. And so I got on a plane and I went to Iraq. And I'd been to Jordan a number of times. I'd walked around Zatri. I'd started to get clued into all of the stuff that was happening. I'd been to places like refugee camps before, Dadaab and these other places. But there was something different about what was brewing in this part of the world. And it struck me in a really, really paralyzing way. And then I just decided, when I was in Iraq and Jordan on that trip, everyone I talked to said, we feel like we have no voice and nobody's talking for us, and we feel forgotten. And by the way, this isn't new. This is old. Baghdadi became in charge of the Islamic State of Iraq in May of 2010. He didn't show up out of nowhere. This organization didn't just materialize. This is like it's been going on for 10 years. There's not a church left in Iraq that doesn't have a blast wall around its building because of the inevitability of a bomb. Like this is not the first time this has happened. It's the next time it's happening. It's just getting worse, and we still have nobody speaking for us and nobody raising their voice. And you were raising your voice because you were in the inside. But I just decided I would tell their stories, and so I did, and I researched it, and I found slave price list that list slaves by age and religion, Yazidis and Christians from 1 to 9 years old, at about $170. I heard stories of pastors that went across villages as ISIS was coming to them, trying to coach people into what to do, and telling people, if ISIS comes to you, they're going to ask you if you believe in Jesus, and you can say, like, just say you follow Jesus, because Jesus is also a prophet, and so maybe, but the chances are it's not going to work. And then the pastor told them it's only going to hurt for a moment. And that family he was describing, a husband and a wife and their 2 kids, like my wife and my 2 kids, it only hurt for a moment, and they were. And I decided I would tell their story. And so I guess that's why I'm here today. And it's sort of a perilous thing to talk about policy after all these distinguished people that have spoken. But I just want to make a few considerations very, very, very briefly, and I'll finish in just a few minutes here. And the first consideration is, as best as it appears to me, and the people I've talked to and the research I've done and the total obsessive immersion I put myself in this subject, is that there is not only no protection for these people in the path of ISIS, there's no plan at all. Now, I'm sure that people sitting around in offices and stuff incubating a plan, but it would begin with not denying that there's a threat to religious minorities in Iraq and in Syria. And by the way, that our denial of this threat against religious minorities is emboldening other actors in other countries. I'm entirely convinced we wouldn't have seen 150 Kenyan, mainly Christian college students gunned down by al-Shabaab if we would have reacted a little more decisively and told the world it's not okay to kill people because of their religion, whether they're moderate Muslims or Christians or Yazidis or Mandeans or Kakais or Shabaks or whatever they are. That's not okay in the modern world. But instead, we will not frame and analyze and look at this conflict in religious terms at all whatsoever. And you can't divorce religion from the conflict. You just can't do it. There are ethnicities involved, and I feel extremely pleased to have learned what I've learned even today, with Dr. Mead. But I have to also say, that ISIS defies some of this in their own consistency. I mean, this is a terrorist group with 90 different countries represented. This is a terrorist group that has fighters, thousands of fighters from Europe and from at least dozens, maybe as many as hundreds from the United States of America. Just like that, the recording you heard. I mean, this is a terrorist group that something more than ethnicity is uniting this terrorist group. It's causing Chechens and Americans and second generation Brits and French people to go over there, and they're going over there in one of 2 categories. They're doing it because they're doing it because they're criminals and they just want to do bad things, like stop killing people on video games, and there's some wild teenager that would be committing atrocities that they had the chance to in their own country, or they're religiously motivated. I mean, it just is the fact. And the people I've talked to, some of them tell me really scary things. They tell me things like this. They say, we don't like what ISIS is doing. We don't believe in the tactics. We would never behead anybody, but we believe in a prophecy of a caliphate. And so if you are that very, 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 very small group of Muslims in this country and around the world that believe that nuanced theological point in a religion of 1 billion people, say it's 0.5%, that's a gigantic number of people. And if you do not necessarily feel compelled by their tactics, and you are put off by them as much as anybody else is in the world, if you believe in this prophecy, then there is a certain tugging to become a part of this thing. That's the reality of some of these people. And by the way, it looks awfully suspicious to them that ISIS controls a piece of land, at least it did, and there's arguments as to whether it still does, the size of the United Kingdom between Iraq and Syria. And ISIS now, in effect, controls large swaths of Libya, and in effect controls the northeast of Nigeria, and pockets of Egypt and in Kenya. And that's kind of the second point that I would make, is that we continue to underestimate how serious this threat is. When the United States government is engaging in airstrikes, but on average 7 to 15 airstrikes a day, is the last number that I read, and it's fluctuated here and there, and it took the United States of America 4 months to kick ISIS out of a non-strategic town in the big picture called Kobani. 4 months. As opposed to the conflict in Bosnia or in Afghanistan, where we were doing 150, 170 airstrikes a day. We're not behaving seriously as the sole superpower in the world. And I know that, by the way, seems to be a controversial thing to say these days, that America is the sole superpower in the world. But and maybe it's not a good good thing to talk about. But the fact is, just look at the data. I mean, just the data says no country has the military strength we have. No country has the economic resources we have. So it's just the reality of the situation. And in this time of incredible instability, if the United States doesn't do it, who else will do it? And what we've seen again and again is when you create these vacuums of power, bad actors have the opportunity to foster their dangerous ideology, and someone will win the day if the good guys don't. Yeah. And the fact is that as the sole superpower in the world, we have a responsibility to be both powerful and to be good. And we haven't handled that region very well, have we? People question how powerful we are now after they've questioned how good we are with the way we handled it. And the United States has to be perceived as both powerful and as good. We have to be perceived as both. And I think we need to have a very, very honest discussion with ourselves. I totally believe that that people have to defend themselves or flee, but they have fled. I saw them in their refugee camps. They fled, and they're starving to death. And there's no infrastructure, and and the world is quietly paying attention. And when I met with the United Nations in Kurdistan, they told me if they operate at 100% efficiency, the best they can do is take care of 40%. And then ISIS moves onto a town called Ramadi, which we deem is not a priority for whatever reason, which later was apologized for. But the fact is, when ISIS started meddling in that country, it displaced 110,000 people in one day. Jordan has 2 million Syrians. So when the world cuts off a World Food Program grant, or the private sector doesn't step up and make the difference, all of a sudden you have millions of people that now can't provide for their family, and that is an incubator for extremism. The world is not taking this threat seriously enough. We are underestimating the complexity of it. We're operating on an Al-Qaeda strategy against ISIS, which is not Al-Qaeda. ISIS is not going to be knocked off by knocking off Baghdadi. It's not a bin Laden strategy. You don't kill the leader. And just read what the RAND Corporation has written on networks and net wars. It's a different beast. It's a different type of warfare. It has to be addressed in a different way. We see it. Just yesterday in the New York Times, a unidentified senior law enforcement official, whatever that means, in Texas was interviewed by the New York Times and asked some very particular questions about how they didn't know this kid from Phoenix was going to attack this event in Texas, because he'd been clearly communicating with ISIS sympathizers across the world. And the answer of the law enforcement official was, there are just so many of them. We have limited resources, so we have to pick those that we follow. And I get that. They're limited resources. I totally understand it. But on the same token, warfare is changing around the world, and terrorism is outpacing us. That's what's happening. There was a study of Arabic language tweets in September-ish by the University of Milan. They studied Arabic language tweets in the United States of America that had the acronym ISIS in them, and categorized them by country as to whether they were supportive or not of ISIS. And in the United States of America, at the height of ISIS, at that auspicious moment, 21.4% of tweets in this country were in support of ISIS in Arabic. Now, of course, that means that over, 79%, 78% weren't in support of ISIS, the vast majority of Muslims in this country. And by the way, I'm sure it was flawed, but even if you take out the controls of spam and duplication and everything, it's a really, really alarming thing, isn't it, when ISIS was terrorizing people in the way that they were and are. And the Brookings Institute, they followed up on that, right? And they identified 46 to 90,000 ISIS Twitter accounts at the end of last year, and 1 out of 5 of those accounts picked English as their first language. So why isn't the United States of America dedicating more resources on a law enforcement and a homeland security level to the digital threat of terrorism? Because that's the network that's uniting these people and inspiring some kid in Nebraska who used to, 10 years ago, would have to go to a training camp in Afghanistan first of all, you'd have to figure out how to get to Afghanistan, and then you live in rudimentary conditions with Osama bin Laden in some mountain somewhere without, water or rudimentary conditions these training camps were. But ISIS has stepped up the game. You sit in the privacy of your own home, curious with nobody looking on. You don't need to have money to buy a plane ticket. You look at your computer screen in your first language, not your second language, and they've outsourced the training camps. So some kid can decide to to take his American passport, as has happened again and again, and get on an airplane and fly to Turkey and move over a porous border, which this week, if you also a story in the New York Times 2 days ago or something, the amount of fertilizer that was conspicuously going over the Turkish border to plant things, I'm sure. And this kid can go to Turkey and he can walk over the border and he can join ISIS, and then he faces reality or he gets enthralled by it, but either way, it's a really, really bad situation. Or he can step out of his home in Nebraska or in South Carolina or Virginia or this city or any big city in the country and walk across the street to a synagogue or to church or to a community center, because the ISIS technique isn't the Al-Qaeda work for 5 years on a complicated strategy that involves training people to fly airplanes and costs millions and millions of dollars. It's a different type of warfare, and they're outpacing us, or at least they're outpacing our willingness to engage in that new type of warfare. We're underestimating them, and just end by saying that there are lots of opportunities in the region. I mean, you think that, there are 20 million Sunnis without a leader. The Jordanians, one thing I've learned very clearly about the Jordanians is they're willing to be engaged on both a military and a humanitarian level. So if there isn't the will, which I disagree with, by the way, the latest polling coming out saying that the Americans are more concerned about ISIS than North Korea, South Korea, Iran, and China, by double digits, by the way. But let's say that is true, and there is no will to be engaged in any meaningful way in that part of the world. When you have nations like Jordan that are absolutely willing to be engaged, the Americans ought to be more involved with the Jordanians. It ought to be a shame to us all that when I was in Kurdistan, I'm sure people don't tell me the most confidential things. I'm talking to people in the Interior Ministry, and they tell me they're fighting with Soviet-era weapons against ISIS with stolen American weapons. I mean, this is unconscionable, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. Like, get people help. Let people live. Give people the resources they need, and it begins with protection. And difficult questions, like, there's all this talk about, is there eventually a Sunni Shia Kurd state? Well, what about the Christians, Yazidis, Kakais, Mandeans, and Shabaks? Where do they go in a Sunni Shia Kurd? So how are these people protected? I just believe that we as individuals, we have to educate ourselves. We have to provide humanitarian assistance in the way that that as Christians, the Antiochian church did for the Jerusalem church in the first century when there was a famine. You remember that? They provided these resources. I think we have to put unrelenting pressure on government. They pay attention. I was part of a group last week trying to get a really, really delightful and Mother Teresa type nun from northern Iraq to the United States to testify in front of Congress nonetheless. She had endorsement letters from Democrat and Republicans. She had sponsorship letters from 2 reputable NGOs, and she shows up in the consulate in Erbil, and we denied her visa. I mean, it's like incomprehensible, brainless policy. Very, 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 and by the way, we're still advocating, 1 week later after raising, quite a bit of pressure, on the State Department to get this nun to the United States Congress to say, if I wouldn't have gotten out of Karakosh as I'd gotten out of Mosul because she was displaced twice, and by the way, she's taking care of Christians, Muslims, and all the religious minorities. Like, this is just, we're not taking it seriously enough. And on the humanitarian point, I just say that every act of kindness on behalf of someone ISIS aims to kill is a dagger in the heart of ISIS. And what a shame for these people who have survived beheading by leaving their cities, or slavery, or whatever the other things they would have done to these people, if they die of a lack of food or shelter. When there are 2 billion Christians in the world, surely we can take care of these people. And I finished it, I promise. I had this surreal moment when I was writing Defying ISIS, where I thought, what if I would have lived in Germany during the Holocaust? And I moved and immigrated to the United States of America. And my children were in school one day, and they came back from school, and they said, "Hey, Dad, we learned about this thing called the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews died." And weren't you in Germany back then? Do you remember that? Now, wouldn't it be an awful experience to have known that you could have done more? The fact is, I'm not an Assyrian, I'm not Armenian, I don't even know what I am. I'm an American. And I've never experienced genocide in my family or these sorts of ethnic conflicts or whatever. I don't know what that feels like. Some of you do know what that feels like from history, and you're witnessing history repeat itself. And you know those stories, but this is the first time it's happening when you're alive. And I'll tell you, one day, my 2-year-old son and my 8-month-old daughter, I want to be able to give them a good answer when they come back from Western civilization. And they say, Dad, we learned about all these Christians that were in the Middle East. Did you know about that? This horrible stuff happened to them. Do you know about that? And I want to be able to say, I did everything I could to rescue everyone I could. I want to have a good answer to that question. And we just don't have time to sit around. So that's all I have to say.
Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Kassab. I am Iraqi-born activist. I migrated to the United States in late in the 70s. And as you know, or might know, that I really do care about our community in Iraq. I want to tell you and share with you some facts about the community itself. A lot of people are speaking about the Christians of Iraq. I just want to tell you who the Christians of Iraq are. The Chaldeans and the Assyrians and the Syriacs made the majority of Christians in ancient Mesopotamia, which is now known as Iraq. They lived as pagans for thousands of years before Christ, where they mastered two very creative civilizations, the Babylonian in the south and the Assyrian in the north. They became Christians in the early cradle of Christianity at the hands of Mari and Mar Edday, the disciples of St. Thomas, the apostle. St. Thomas was in his way to India to preach Christianity, and he stopped in Iraq, and he commissioned his disciples to help out with spreading Christianity in that area. Throughout the centuries, they survived the vicious atrocities of the Romans, the Persians, the advent of Islamist and forced Islamization, the Mongols, the Tatars, the Ottomans, the brutal regimes, the uncontrolled armed sectarian militia, and nowadays they hope to survive the brutality of radical ISIS and the imposing of disgraceful Islamic Sharia laws and Islamization. As a result of these atrocities, Christian numbers drastically dwindled from more than 7 million before the advent of Islam to roughly 1.4 million Christians before 2003 war. But nowadays they count less than 400,000, as more than 250,000 of them are uprooted from the ancient Nineveh and its plains since the start of ISIS invasion in June 2014. They are now internally displaced persons, IDPs, living in awful conditions inside their own country, and thousands of them already managed to flee to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, seeking protection and then hoping to be settled in the Western countries. In Iraq before 2003, we had 350 churches. Today, there are fewer than 50 operational churches, as parishioners are shying away from worshiping due to fear of attacks. Many churches have been destroyed, burned, or bombed. Sadly, some are desecrated, for ISIS is using them as terror facilities and prisons. Also, many of our ancient ruins and valued manuscripts dating back to the cradle of Christianity has been destroyed in an effort to wipe out our identity. We believe the U.S. administration and the U.S. foreign policy makers are obligated to exercise a unique role to resolve this slow genocide and to provide safety and protection for Iraq's most hurt, the ethno-religious minorities like the Christians and the Yazidis, because their plight in today's Iraq is a direct result of the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. For several years, USCIRF, which is the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, has been making its recommendation to the U.S. administration to consider Iraq as a country of particular concern to the United States based on violations of human rights and freedom of religion. The poorly planned and executed goal of Saddam's regime removal and the most recent withdrawal of U.S. troops left in its wake a vulnerable and decentralized national government, sectarian warfare, loose and armed sectarian militia, and above all, lack of unity and trust among the people of Iraq. Also, the tepid army and corrupt security forces left Iraq unable to protect itself as its borders became very porous, inviting foreign terrorists to enter and cause harm and then easily uproot the helpless and the unprotected like the Christians. In about 1 year now, our people are still in exile. There are no signs of hope that this situation will be resolved. People have lost their dignity. They despair, and as all you know, despair means darkness. This hope can be realized if the U.S. administration and the international community, along with the people of good faith, like you, can come to the rescue. The U.S. must finish what it started. This cancer of radicalization and forced Islamization has become intolerable in Iraq. It must be defeated and permanently. Now, before I talk about the policy and proposed durable solutions, I would like you to learn more of why this chaos and violence is happening in Iraq. We need to know that after 2003 war, several serious drastic changes took place in Iraq, ranging from Iraqi borders became unguarded, Muslims of Iraq became more sectarian than secular, armed sectarian militia are roaming in Iraq uncontrolled, kidnapping and killing the helpless, for ransom. Uniformed Iraqi army and security forces were furloughed, leaving the country undefended, and those who were let go to use their arms against their own countrymen and even joining the foreign terrorists like ISIS. Country's best professionals, educators, and scholars were assassinated, causing a severe brain drain in the country. And of course, the self-centered political agenda, the self-centered political agenda of the new ruling parties are sharing with their followers the wealth of Iraq in a major scheme of corruption ever known, leaving the average Iraqi person to live under poverty level. The most drastic change among all, however, is allowing ISIS to brutally invade more than 1/3 of the country without putting any fight to defend its people. As a result of this invasion, more than 250,000 Christians and over 500,000 Yazidis became displaced in Iraq, and nearly 100,000 refugees fled abroad, emptying the whole Nineveh province and its plains. As of today, the displaced Christians numbers are as following: 95,000 IDPs in Erbil, and its remote villages, 80,000 IDPs in Duhok and its remote villages, 15,000 IDPs in Sulaimania, 30,000 IDPs in Kirkuk, 47,000 refugees in Turkey, 28,000 refugees in Lebanon, 20,000 refugees in Jordan, and another 3,000 refugees scattered throughout Europe. Unfortunately, what is certain that it will not be able to go home even if their villages are liberated, because they do not want to face and live again with the local Muslims who they affirmed their allegiance to ISIS and helped identify for them Christian homes to be confiscated by ISIS. And as you all know, they mark them with a letter Noon. Noon in English means N, and that is exactly what Reverend Khalid already has produced. This is unfortunate that this was allowed in Iraq, and I'm sure a lot of you remember the Star of David during the Nazi time, where Jewish were identified as with the Star of David. So you can see that these guys are really very smart. They know what they're doing, and they know how to identify their victims. Why should we save the Christians in the Middle East and in Iraq? It is imperative to know that the absence of Christianity from the Middle East will lead to a great political ramification, since Christians are known to be the voice of moderation, reconciliation, and mitigation during times of conflicts, which are very common in this particular region. This is in addition to their belief in accepting the other, promote coexistence and peace, not to mention their essential contribution to the society. All of this should strongly convince the Muslim world, which wanted to defend Islam values, to denounce Islamic radicalism, and terrorism committed against Christians and others. A lot of you, I'm sure you're aware of that the Christians are now caught between tough choices. You heard that from Professor Mead, and he so eloquently stated that people either had to stay or to leave. And of course, the community here in the diaspora is trying to provide its best to help out its community in Iraq. And there are several thoughts of how to help out. So yes, one of the issues that we are discussing is, can the community stay? And if stay, how can it defend itself? And of course, you heard from Mindy that we have already on the ground what we call MPU, which is the Nineveh plane units, that they just armed themselves and they are willing to defend their own community. But unfortunately, they're not getting enough support, and the government of Iraq is not recognizing them as of today, and I'm not sure the Kurdish government will give them enough support either. Therefore, the support should come from outside, and I'm not sure the laws will allow that to happen. So what we're suggesting is, first is to stay and defend themselves, and number two is to seek the international community intervention and provide protection for these people. This is not as easy as you know. And so far, the U.S. administration and many countries in Europe have not shown that particular interest at this time. Although we have been talking to the UN member states on this issue, but we haven't heard anything from them yet. The third solution is for them to leave, and some of them already made their mind that they want to leave. And if they leave, how we are able to open the gates for them. This is something is not easy, as we all know. We have been talking to the, as I said earlier, to the United Nations member states in order to open their gates for these people and take them in. There are some pledges made, but so far it hasn't materialized. But the biggest problem is that these people, they want to come either to the United States or Canada or Australia. And United States administration, through many programs that they have, well, one of them is called the U.S. Refugee Admission Program. It's not helping a lot. We start to see some partiality here, and people are not taken into Christians of Iraq mainly. They are not easily taken, so they've been put on the back burner, let's put it this way. We have people whom they already went to United Nations in Turkey and Syria. I'm sorry, in Turkey and Lebanon. Just left like about 6-7 months ago, and they've been given appointments for interviews just to recognize them as refugees for the year 2020 and 2022. So imagine how much they can survive until then, especially when they don't have the money, especially when they are depressed and they are going through very, very hard time. So we are proposing some solutions based on what is happening to the community. I want to cut through this short. And so one of the most important solutions that we are putting on, for the Iraqi government and Kurdistan government is to help alleviate the suffering of the people by recognizing or enshrining their rights, their civil and ethno-religious rights in the Constitution. That's very important. It's really not, it's very vague, the recognition of the rights of the minorities, especially the Christians, in the Constitution of Iraq, and so is the draft of the Kurdish Constitution. So we want to see this happen. That is the first thing. The second thing is we want to, as you heard me, provide we want to see an international protection for those who want to return and stay, and to guarantee the return of their homes, lands, and properties. As you know, majority, all of them actually, their homes and their properties were taken away from them. Some of them are destroyed, some of them are sold to others, and some of them are taken by others, so they cannot just go back and live there anymore. Number 3 is support the newly created community-based Nineveh protection units, as we spoke, and push for the calling of the semi-autonomous area in that particular region, and to establish maybe the Nineveh Plain province. Number 4 is provide and better coordinate the targeted humanitarian relief to reach all. I want to share with you the fact that a lot of help and relief is not getting into Iraq as it was expected. The donors are giving some of their donations, the country donors, to government of Iraq. And all of you know that the government of Iraq is, it is the corruption. It's max among their officials, and therefore this money is not going anywhere. So we've been pressing on the Iraqi government through the U.S. administration to release this money and give it to the people who became displaced. This is hard, but it's not happening. Also, there is a very uncoordinated effort to provide relief for our people, so people don't get to have enough relief. Some of them, they live in remote areas that they were never reached. We've been hearing a lot of stories. I don't want to share that with you. You've heard already some stories, but one of the stories I heard that the children in one town, it's in Shaklawa, north of Shaklawa, they are alternating between them the dinner meal. So in other words, today is Thursday, I eat, the next day is my sister can eat. That's how bad the situation is even in Kurdistan, because the relief is not getting there. Also, we want to see, really, so this is very important, to ensure the passage, the safe passage and resettlement by prioritizing assistance and admission to the Western countries for those IDPs and refugees who decided not to return. Another recommendation or solution that we are also providing is for the U.S. to expand its foreign policy tools to include filling the vacant post of a special presidential envoy for religious minorities in the Middle East. This is really very essential for the U.S. to have, and hasn't happened yet, and I don't know why the U.S. administration is not taking a decision on that yet, although the Congress has approved it already. We also asking securing an equitable representation of Christians in all branches of Iraqi and Kurdistan government and the National Assembly. Also, we want to see ensuring fair allocation of Iraqi budget for the Christians in a proportion with its with its population density, just like the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shias. Everybody is getting his own share. Why not the Christians in this case? And lastly, we want to see a significant investment in the education as a key tool for advancing religious freedom and pluralism and to mitigate radicalism. Before I close, I would like to talk in brief on the touchy issue of migration and resettlement. At the extreme concerns of Pope Francis, Cardinal Filoni and Cardinal Sandri visited Iraq to show support for the church flock and its leaders. The cardinals renewed their call and of the Holy Fathers for assistance from the international community in favor of all those facing persecution in Iraq, and especially for the country's suffering and sorely tried Christian community. This also echoed the Chaldeans Patriarch Sacco recent speech to the United Nations Security Council to provide immediate assistance and protection for all Iraqis. It is a fact that the Vatican and the Church of Iraq has been calling for the discouragement of migration from Iraq. Finding solution for them to stay in their homeland is their optimal suggestion, but it is a challenge for sure. Christians are on the run from Iraq as their situation is becoming more vulnerable. This is well described by many scholars like Nina Shea, who wrote in an NRO article that people are in despair and they need help. It is also well documented by many reporters and journalists who visited the area. This bitter fact is known for all, but the church has hard time accepting it, and therefore no help is rendered to this questionable need. For those who argue that Christians should stay in their homeland, we say we are all for it, in the heart and in the mind, because we do not want to empty Iraq from its ancient people, and we will continue to advocate for their safe stay and guaranteed prosperity. But for those who decided not to return, we have no choice but to continue to advocate with UN member states, including the US, to open their gates for resettlement on humanitarian concerns. This may bring an end to the Refugees Act of desperation to reach the diaspora through taking dangerous sea voyages operated by smugglers, and I'm sure you heard a lot on this. To conclude, time has come for the world policymakers, human rights activists, NGOs, think tanks, journalists, Church of America, and the U.S. community at large to confront the prospects of Christianity's eradication in the region of its cradle, and to ensure that their brothers and sisters in faith in Iraq are not forgotten. Any society that do not allow for religious freedom for all is a society that is giving the persecutors a step towards the ultimate power. My question is, where is the outcry by the Americans, especially the Christians, against this persecution, and why the partiality and the silence of the U.S. administration? Thank you.
Samuel said we could stand or sit, so I'm going to sit. And I'm going to try to be brief because I think we're going to have a Q&A, and I know we'll have lots of questions. Is my mic not on? Is the mic not on? Microphone. Is my mic not working? There. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. So I think that everybody has obviously, I think, defined the problem very well, and I think most people in this room care a lot about this issue. That's why they're here. Unfortunately, also I think what's been established is most of the country doesn't seem to know.
So a break for a few minutes. Break for a few minutes.
Nina invited me, as I have written a lot of columns on this issue for USA Today and the Daily Beast, and I'm one of the few people, though, frankly, who write about it. And I think one of the reasons that is because people, I think, are afraid to tell stories where Muslims are the aggressors because they're afraid of being called an Islamophobe. And that's, of course, insulting to Muslims because this is not about Muslims. This is about radical Islam. These are very radical people, especially with ISIS. And so I think that you see a desire to create a false equivalency, like we saw the president doing, bringing up the Crusades at the National Prayer Breakfast, almost to say, well, okay, so bad things are happening, but you guys did bad things too. Of course, we'd like to stay in this century, maybe would be helpful. If we're going to really take a serious issue as seriously as we should. And I think that we can identify as many solutions as I think a lot of people have laid out here, but until you can get the American people to really get behind them, it's not going to make a difference. And right now, I don't think, even if you have a poll saying they care about ISIS, I don't think that they're engaged on the issue or even understand that there's a genocide going on. And the only people that I really can see who can take a leadership role in this issue are the churches. And Frank Wolf has been very critical of American churches, saying, where is the broad movement? Where is the real energy behind this issue? I mean, the Christians are very powerful in this country. Actually, if you see when Christians do get upset about things, and I don't mean this in a snarky way, but if you look at what happened when Phil Robertson, the Duck Dynasty guy, lost his show, I mean, we saw Christians get really organized and make noise. And so Christians can get organized and make noise. They can be, as a Jewish friend said to me, who's a journalist, said, why aren't Christians outside the White House just 24/7? It's mind-boggling, to a Jewish person to see what's happening in the Middle East and that Christians aren't really demonstrating and complaining, and that the president really isn't going to do anything, if he's ever going to do anything, unless there is a massive outcry about it. This is clearly not something that he's going to engage in on his own. So, to me, the clearest solution is for the church to get really engaged and to really have, and we've talked, Johnny and I have emailed about this, how to get them engaged, how to get them to really appreciate this issue. And I think that and then educating people, because also the conversation that happens a lot, especially in the media in the United States, is that the Christians are the persecutors. The Christians are the oppressors, historically, in the minds of the people who cover these things. And they can't quite get their mind around the idea of poor, marginalized, Black and brown Christians being persecuted. It's just not what they think of when they think of Christianity. And so I think that also there needs to be a lot of education. And my interest in the topic came from the fact that I was married into a Coptic Christian family, and I'm still very close to them. And in fact, some of you may know Mama Maggie, who she's considered the Mother Teresa of Cairo, and she lives her life under a constant, fear of being killed, essentially, for what she does and for living out her faith. So this is something that isn't just has to do with ISIS. This is just, if you're a Christian in the Middle East, it can be a very dangerous place to be. So I just say thank God for Nina Shea and for Samuel. I mean, truly, they have educated me so much on this topic, and it's very hard as a journalist to find people who are really reliable and really know their facts, and you can know that when they tell you something, you can take it to the bank and you can write it, and no one's going to come back and say it's not true. So, I just think I'm so thankful for what they do, and would love to hear your questions.
So let me begin the conversation by discussing the changing map of the Middle East. We have an Iraq and a Syria that are no longer states, and they're unlikely to ever be states again. Washington may still continue to deal with them as if there is an Iraqi government or the possibility of a Syrian government. But the reality is that, as Walter Russell Mead has pointed out, we're going to see huge changes going on in that region. We're going to see places, as happened in Yugoslavia, that were once included various communities, now one state represents one nation. Is there a possibility for a Christian nation there? If that possibility exists, who's going to be its army? We've heard about the Christian militia. A militia of 500 might be possible to protect a couple of villages. Even if we give them 10,000 weapons, even if they rise to 5,000 people, it still does not mean that they will be able to have an army or to protect a state. Is it the future of the Christians then to be part of another state, a Kurdish state that will be including other minorities as well? Does this state mean that it has to be a Kurdish state with some fellow minorities there, or a national or a citizen-based state that would include everyone? The history between the Kurds and the Christians has not always been perfect. We've heard in the beginning of the discussions about the Kurdish role in the Armenian genocide, for example. So how do we see that? But then is the other option of resettlement, both in the United States with limited possibilities under this government or any government. There's simply no place in the Western world for 10 million Christians from the Middle East, if we include the Copts and the Syrian Christians and others. If we're talking about resettlement in the countries themselves, or in the region itself, then we're looking at a scenario of the Palestinians. You had Jewish immigrants kicked out of the whole Arab world, and today there are no Jewish refugees in Israel. They've become part of society. But the Palestinian refugees continue to live in camps until today. Is that the fate we're going to see for the Christians, living in camps, unable to become citizens of Jordan, of Lebanon, of others? What's the solution? I know it's a big question. I've laid out a horrible state, to say the least. But there doesn't seem to be that many good options there, or any option at all.
Well, the Christians has already had asked for an autonomous area for themselves, just like what the Kurds did. And not only that, also they want to see if they can have a province of their own. As a matter of fact, they came up with a name which is Nineveh Plain Province. This came after the encouragement came from the Iraqi president, Talabani, who suggested that the Christians should have their own. This is something that we would like to see taking place. But as you said earlier, it comes with a lot of ramifications. But more importantly is that the area itself in Iraq, especially in northern Iraq, is highly contested between the Kurds and the Arabs. The area where Christians lived, and there are big numbers, and that's where they were pushed out from, is Nineveh Plain. The Nineveh Plain area is the size of Lebanon, and there were more than 150,000 Christians live in that area. They've all been pushed out now. Now, if we are assuming that all these people are going to go back, there will be a lot of things has to be provided for them. And this is not possible. This is not possible at this time with what's going on. The reason for that is the reason I'm saying it's not possible. It is because the area is becoming very radicalized, and not only that, people who wants to go back, they don't want to live with people who already hurt them and joined the radicals against them. So it's not possible. I think it's going to create a lot of problems. So therefore, our chances of having a place, we would love to have it, it is not as good as supposed to be. At least not nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else would like to?
I would just say that it's interesting if you think about 2005, 2006, when a lot of the discussion of a Nineveh Plain province began, to where we are today. You know, you're hearing different things from some of the church leaders and from the people who are living there day in and day out. And you're also seeing a lot of changes, and I'll just mention a couple that I've seen in the last year, even before, as ISIS began in Fallujah and Ramadi and then moved on into Nineveh. One is that a tremendous amount of cooperation that's happening right now among the Chaldean, the Orthodox, the evangelical even. This is something that was not at all present in Iraq
right.
10 years ago. There's a tremendous amount of cooperation among those church leaders that has been brought as a number of people because of, the martyrs have brought people together. And then the other interesting thing is that the Kurds, who for so long wanted their own country, now that they actually control more land than they ever have controlled, it seems to me you're hearing them talk less about that. That's a whole different topic, but all to say that what I hear in just the recent trips there is the Christians who have stayed throughout this time and have seen these varying political iterations and have seen the danger get not less, but have seen it grow more, do not really trust in a geographical area, as you're saying. What they would trust in is what we would call a rule of law, an idea of a country that would allow them to have equal standing. And I've heard this said, and I've heard church leaders say this to the Kurdish authorities, to the Baghdad authorities. We do not want to live apart from you. We want to live beside you. We want to come alongside you and be involved in organizations, in schooling, education, cultural endeavors alongside you. And it seems to me that if they're to have any role there, that it's going to have to look like that in some way. I'd be curious what you...
The problem is Iraq at this time, it is not in its normal, situation, and as I said, there are too many political parties ruling Iraq now, and there is a really very, very vicious sectarian war between Sunnis and Shias. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't see it. And as you heard from Professor Mead, when the big fish fight, then the little ones get hurt. And that's exactly what's happening in Iraq now. If we are able to put the Sunnis and the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds, for that matter, together, and try to respect each other's agenda, I think then we will have a good Iraq. The other problem we have in Iraq, as you heard me, is the corruption. These people, for many, many years during Saddam time, they were deprived from pennies, not from dollars. And now, so many billions of dollars getting into their hands, they just don't know what to do with it. And majority of this money is flying out of Iraq and invested in England, in the United States, and in Europe. And I do not think this money will come back to the people of Iraq. So there is a problem. We need to solve the problem from its base, not just see what we want to do there. And this is not going to happen anytime soon. That's why our people are not very optimistic about staying in the country.
Yeah, two things occur to me. The first thing is, I don't think we should give up on the thought of people in the Middle East being able to live free from fear, whether they're Sunni, Shia, Christian, or whatever else, right? I mean that, and secondly, it occurs to me that not a lot of people are really thinking about a regional solution. Period. So if you talk, the fact that there are 20 million Sunnis with no direct leadership, right? And so what we find, ISIS comes into a town, and these are moderate Sunnis, and so they don't agree with ISIS anyhow, but they end up submitting. And then you have the Shia militias, and they go in and they don't discern who was with ISIS or who wasn't with ISIS, and you have the threat of extermination. And so I just think that I'm concerned that people aren't thinking comprehensively. And secondly, I'm concerned that the private sector isn't stepping up. I mean, there could be some really innovative solutions here. Like what if the Syrian refugees aren't like the Somalian refugees. The Somalian refugees is a different issue. They're uneducated, to begin with. They were poor to begin with. There were decades of famine and such. But the Syrians aren't that way. They're educated. They were upwardly mobile. Everybody I talked to had two-story houses and cars and kids in college. I mean, there's a lot of raw material there to build a society. So what if the private sector stepped up and the diasporan communities around the world worked with a country, Kurdistan or Jordan or something, and set up a semi-autonomous zone that was a Dubai. It could be a mini Dubai, with the incentivizing of investment. You have raw material. You partner with companies around the world. I mean, there could be intermediary solutions with the private sector highly engaged, in a profitable way that takes advantage of all of this, that doesn't rely on bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or in London, or, to get all the chess pieces in a way where it's eventually going to work 30 years from now, but by the time more people hate each other. I just think the private sector needs to step up while the government is kind of struggling through all this.
Well, we are out of time. I want to thank our panel, and on that optimistic note, that pep talk, we're going to conclude our conference, but I want to thank all our spectacular speakers. Everyone was enlightening, inspiring, and extraordinary. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Sarah Stern and Ken Weinstein and my colleagues, Bill Ludi, my other colleagues at the Hudson Institute for helping me put this together and for supporting it all. And I want to tell everybody, go forth, do what you can do, raise your voice, and let's continue to work together.
Thank you.